Greetings. My name is Peter McCormick. Beginning at age 5 and over the following 72 years, I have owned and sailed and enjoyed a series of small sailboats. I've always loved ships, boats, and the sea, and have been deeply interested in all forms of maritime history. I think I come by these nautical interests naturally, given the fact that my great-great-grandfather, Captain William Weeks, and his son-in-law, Captain Andrew Heyer, between them made 22 whaling voyages out of New Bedford between 1833 and 1895, and they were master for 12 of those voyages. But until late in life, I had never sailed a square-rigged ship. So, to recreate some sense of what life was like on 18th century square rigger, I invite you to join me aboard His Majesty's Bark Endeavour, the ship in which British Captain James Cook explored the Pacific from 1768 to 1771. We'll be sailing on two ships at once. In our imagination, we'll sail the 18th century original, and in reality, we'll be sailing the 20th century replica. And with a little luck, you won't even get your feet wet. In 1998, my good wife gave me a Christmas present of a westbound voyage across the Atlantic. Now, when your wife sends you to sea in an 18th century square rigger, you know one of two things. Either she loves you, but I hoped for the best. Now, understanding Endeavour requires some historical background. This is King George III, the same king who in just a few years would lose America to us revolting colonists. In 1767, the prestigious Royal Society of London, in its day the rough equivalent of our National Academy of Science, petitioned the king to send an expedition to the South Seas to observe a rare transit of Venus in 1769. Careful measurements of the passing of Venus across the face of the sun would allow astronomers to calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun and lead to improved navigation. Transits occur in pairs, separated by 8 years, followed by a gap of 100 years. An earlier effort had failed, and the next transit would not occur until 1868. In fact, there was a transit in 2012. And the next one won't be until 2117. So the king agreed, but ordered an additional secret objective of searching for Terra Australis Incognita, a vast southern continent which was rumored to exist. The Admiralty purchased a second-hand ship named the Earl of Pembroke, seen here in Whitby Harbor. Built to carry coal around the North Sea, the type was called a Whitby Cat. The selection was based on the type's strength, seaworthiness, shallow draft, and enormous carrying capacity. Captain Bligh's vessel Bounty was a smaller example of the same type. The Admiralty renamed her Endeavour, and in fact, our own space ship Endeavour was named after Cook's vessel. She was re-rigged to Royal Navy standards, and where the hold had been open to carry coal, they built a new lower deck running the length of the ship, and underneath the original accommodation deck back aft. The result was excessive headroom in the new central living area and totally inadequate headroom in the aft end of the lower deck. The lower hold of the original was filled with barrels of food, water, and supplies, but in the replica, this space contains refrigeration space aft, then an engine room, then a modern galley and crew eating space, and at the bow, showers and toilets for the crew. In 1767, Captain Samuel Wallis had returned to England in the ship Dolphin with news of his discovery of an island called Otaheite, and it was chosen as the ideal spot for observing Venus. Now, I'm talking about the astronomical body and not the young ladies. An artist on Endeavour did this very first painting of Matavai Bay when they arrived there. Now we meet Sir Joseph Banks, 6 foot 4 inches tall, an educated, hugely wealthy 24-year-old who was already a Fellow of the Royal Society and an ardent naturalist and botanist. Instead of a life of luxury and leisure, Banks wanted to go adventuring in Endeavour in the pursuit of science. Well, the Admiralty said, "All right, but you have to pay your own way." So Banks paid the equivalent of $1 million to move aboard, bringing a staff of 8 assorted botanists, artists, assistants, and servants, along with tons of equipment, 1 spaniel, and, get this, 1 greyhound. Banks was bright and industrious, and by the end of the voyage had documented 3,600 known plant species and 1,400 new species and 1,000 species of animals. He later became an Earl and President of the Royal Society for 42 years, and one of England's most influential men of science. To command Endeavour, 40-year-old James Cook was promoted to lieutenant. In Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, Cook is a national hero on a par with Francis Drake and Admiral Lord Nelson. Cook was an extraordinary man. The son of a Yorkshire farm labourer, he had little education, was apprenticed at 18 to a grocer and haberdasher on the east coast of England, but he hated that and managed to get released and apprenticed instead to a shipowner in the port of Whitby. He then spent the next 9 years hauling coal around the North Sea and became an expert seaman. At age 27, he was offered command of a collier, but astounded everyone by refusing it and instead enlisting in the Royal Navy as a lowly able seaman. To its great credit, the Navy quickly recognized his ability, and he advanced rapidly. He studied incessantly and mastered mathematics, astronomy, navigation, and cartography. He made the first accurate charts of the St. Lawrence River and the entire coast of Newfoundland, and his charts were so good that they were still being used 100 years later. Never bashful, Cook once said, "It's my ambition to not only go farther than any other man has gone, but to go as far as I think it's possible for a man to go." So Cook was not a man lacking in confidence. During the Endeavour voyage, he charted the entire coast of New Zealand and the whole east coast of Australia. And this was just the start of 3 voyages and 9 years of exploration, during which he put his mark on history by charting the Pacific and opening it up to Europeans. In the early 1990s, an exact replica of Cook's Endeavour was built in Fremantle, Australia, the finest replica ship ever built. Every detail was researched and approved by the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England, and the quality of materials and workmanship was absolutely superb. Her frames and planking are of an Australian hardwood called jarrah. The botanical name is Eucalyptus marginata, It's so hard you can't drive a nail without first drilling a hole. The framework is massive. Some of these frames are nearly 2 feet wide. This view of the port bow justifies my use of the word massive, and also shows the extreme bluffness of the bow. This is definitely not a clipper ship. Although massive, the ship is nicely finished, with lots of decorative carvings. She required 500,000 hours of labor to build and cost roughly $17 million US. This could be mistaken for a ship model, but it's the actual vessel, fully rigged and dry docked. She's 110 feet long on deck, 29 feet wide, with a draft of 14 feet. She weighs about 550 tons, of which 350 tons is the ship itself and 200 tons is lead ballast. People often ask, what is that white stuff they've put on the bottom? Well, the official, highly technical Admiralty name for it is white stuff, an anti-fouling compound made of fish oil, turpentine, and brimstone. 10 years later, copper bottoms would be standard on all Royal Navy vessels. The replica was making a 4-year voyage around the world, and I joined for the transatlantic leg at the harbor of Santa Cruz on Tenerife in the Canary Islands, which incidentally is the harbor Lord Nelson was attacking when he lost his right arm. I was very surprised to find 10 square-rigged ships there. It wasn't hard to find Endeavour. I just walked the waterfront, searching for the best-looking ship in the harbor, and signed aboard. In port, she flies the original Royal Navy Red Ensign, but at sea she flies the Australian ensign, reflecting her country of registry. When Cook left England, he was carrying 1,600 gallons of rum, 1,200 gallons of beer, and just to be on the safe side, he stopped at Madeira and loaded 6,000 gallons of wine. It was normal for each sailor to have a gallon of beer per day. I was astonished to learn that Cook also carried a machine to convert seawater to drinking water. P.S. It didn't work, but it's very interesting that they were attempting it at such an early date. Our replica carried 10 tons of fresh water in tanks and had a reverse osmosis machine that could make 3 tons a day. And we departed Tenerife under sail at dusk, and commenced a trip of 5 weeks and 4,400 miles from Tenerife to Cape Verde, to Tortola, to Turks and Caicos, to Nassau, and ending in West Palm Beach. Of course, the wind immediately came dead on the nose and blew 30 knots, making the first 2 or 3 days pretty lumpy going. This is Captain Chris Blake, a small, energetic, wiry man born in Kenya, and an exceedingly competent professional shipmaster. He had commanded giant cruise ships and 3 major sail training vessels prior to Endeavour. He's an expert in square rig and a master of leadership and human relations. An ideal choice for the job. Each day, when the sun breaks over the eastern horizon, it signals the start of some well-established shipboard routines. Before breakfast, the morning watch gives the ship a complete saltwater washdown, not only for cleanliness, but also to keep the wooden decks swollen and tight. Elbow grease and scrub brushes are applied, and bare feet are the uniform of the day. Also before breakfast, Tina, an extremely competent topman, would polish the ship's bell to a blinding glare. She's standing on the barrel of the windlass, which has square holes into which you fit long wooden levers to turn the barrel. The red belfry is hardwood and probably weighs 1,000 pounds. Weight is not a big concern on this ship. After breakfast, the whole crew assembles in the waist for muster and the morning meeting. It looks like a crowd, but we had only 56 people on board, while Cook had 95 people, along with sheep, pigs, chickens, a goat, several cats, and 2 dogs. In fact, one of Cook's men wrote in his journal, "The ship combined disciplined efficiency with large elements of the playground, the farmyard, and the traveling circus." The captain brings the charts, shows our position and where we're headed, and gives a detailed weather forecast along with a general plan of the day. During the meeting, a couple of buckets of seawater would be dumped on anyone having a birthday, so you had to be a little cautious about whom you sat next to. Our crew of 56 was 2/3 men, 1/3 women, with an age range from 18 to 64, and hailing from Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and the U.S. There are 14 permanent paid crew, and the remaining 42 are called voyage crew, and they are paying for the privilege of working the ship. Backgrounds included nurse, carpenter, welder, pig farmer, meteorologist, blacksmith, biologist, anesthetist, banker, some people think those are the same, rancher, doctor, school teacher, lady cabinet maker, army officer, and landed British gentry. You name it, we had it. Interestingly, Cook's third officer was an American named John Gore, who had already sailed around the world twice. And when Cook was killed by natives on his third voyage in 1779, it was the American Gore who took command and brought his ship, the Resolution, which was used for Cook's second and third voyages, back to England. The crew's divided into 3 watches, foremast, mainmast, and mizzenmast, with roughly 14 people in each. This is the mizzenmast watch. The leader of each watch is called the topman, whether male or female. There's another group called the idlers, consisting of the engineer, the cook, the shipwright, etc., who supposedly work only during the day, but the term is certainly a misnomer. This is the shipwright, and if I had been smart enough to use a flash, you would have seen that the left side of his face is completely painted with Maori designs in celebration of the Australian holiday Waitangi Day. After morning meeting, everybody turns to for cleaning stations and spends an hour or 2 sweeping, dusting, scrubbing, wiping, and polishing all of the interior living spaces. The captain here is inspecting the officer's shower, and in the foreground, the 2 chaps who cleaned it are trying to make up for a night of no sleep. Endeavour is ship-rigged, and this shows her 9 square sails. The mizzen carries only a topsail, but the main and foremasts both carry from the bottom up a course, a topsail, and a topgallant. The most unusual sails are the 2 square sails underneath the bowsprit. The inner one is the spritsail, and the outer one is the sprit topsail. The ship also carries 8 fore and aft sails, jibs and staysails, making a total of 17 sails, which amount to 10,000 square feet of canvas. And she can set additional light sails as well. To handle those sails, there are lines everywhere you look. This is the base of the mainmast. And this is the base of the foremast, with an orderly but bewildering array of lines. Many familiar phrases come from ships. When you refer to some person as being the mainstay of an organization, you mean that person is important, strong, and dependable. And the reference is to this large black diagonal line, which is the mainstay of the ship, and is definitely important, strong, and dependable. Coils of line hang from cleats on all the shrouds, and at deck level there are lines secured to the black timber heads. And the base of the mizzenmast is crowded with coils. This young woman is an Australian cabinet maker, demonstrating that the size of the sheet for the main course is about as big as her wrist, which is appropriate because these lines are carrying big loads. In the 1700s, when a farm boy was kidnapped and pressed into the Royal Navy, the first few weeks aboard must have been a perfect nightmare of confusion. He had to learn the location and purpose of perhaps 300 lines, not one of which was labeled. How do you possibly learn the ropes? Well, back then they just beat you with a club or a lash, but today they give you a set of pin diagrams, from which you are supposed to memorize where every line is located. This diagram shows the bowsprit area, where there are many lines. And this is what that area actually looks like. No lines are labeled. In a nutshell, getting to know the ropes is a daunting challenge. At night, there are no lights on deck or in the rigging, and crew are expected to be able to find all the correct lines in the dark. But people grab hold, and they learn by doing, prompted by the paid crew. And through some miracle, the sails do get set. And the ship plunges ahead, with her bluff bow kicking up a wonderful fuss. Working the ship involves plenty of pulling and hauling. There are no winches, and every job is done through Armstrong power. Working at the mainmast. Things can get crowded, and sometimes it's hard to get enough people on the lines. Here they are, trimming the main course sheet. Sometimes 10 people would be hauling on this sheet. The chant used for hauling was 2, 6, heave, which was unfamiliar to me, but which comes from the fact that in the Royal Navy a gun crew consisted of 6 men, and after the gun was fired, number 2 man and number 6 were required to heave the gun back into position. Lines don't always lead to cleats, and here they are secured to what is called the rough tree rail, which surrounds the quarterdeck. And this poor fellow's face is turning red from being strangled by an aggressive crewman. This structure is one of 2 called carrack heads, which support the ship's windlass, and were often carved with human faces. The ship's rig contains over 19 miles of lines. You may notice the black bands around the mast. These are called woldings and consist of tightly wrapped circles of line. The masts are not a single piece of wood, but are made up of many long pieces carefully fitted together and secured by the woldings. The ship was very well sailed, and the captain always carried all the sail that he could. And if you look very closely at the black fighting top, you might be able to see 2 of the crew looking down. Running downwind in the open ocean in a square-rigged ship is a fabulous feeling. The ocean is majestic, and gazing at an empty horizon for a few weeks at a time tends to recalibrate your sense of perspective. The sails silently communicate an enormous sense of power. And the rigging provides endless artistic silhouettes. Steering is normally a two-person job. The man in the white shirt is called the brains, and he's watching the compass and calling the shots. The man in the dark shirt is the muscle, and only when ordered he moves the wheel a specific number of spokes to starboard or port. She can be difficult to steer and can occasionally get away from you. The rudder is tall and narrow and weighs 2.5 tons. And inside the yellow doghouse, the rudder head attaches to a tiller, which is 16 feet long. The end of the tiller is attached to a block and tackle, which leads the tiller rope around the drum of the steering wheel. On good days, classes were conducted on the quarterdeck. Lectures on meteorology, navigation, even history. Here, the first mate is teaching the use of the sextant. And here, a couple of ambitious students are trying their luck at taking their first sun sight. Not satisfied with exercising only the mind, the captain also arranged for regular physical exercise, in which he participated enthusiastically in his red shirt. In Cook's day, this would have been an ominous sight, for when you saw the hatch grating up against the shrouds, somebody was going to get flogged. Strangely, the first man flogged by Cook was punished for refusing to eat fresh meat. He wanted the more familiar salt horse. The cat-o'-nine-tails was kept in a bag of blood-red baize, and the crew knew they had a problem when somebody let the cat out of the bag. That's the origin of the phrase, which has nothing to do with felines. After sunset, no one was allowed on deck without wearing one of these excellent reflective vests. My camera flash shows just how effective they are. When there are no lights on deck, the full moon can be very helpful. This fellow is climbing the shrouds to go on watch in the mizzen fighting top, looking backward, not forward, for overtaking vessels. The term fighting top refers to these black platforms up the mast, which are found only on naval ships. They were occupied by sharpshooters during battle, and that's how the Spanish riflemen killed Admiral Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. Where the mast penetrates the fighting top is an area called the hounds, where all the shrouds and stays terminate with a loop over the mast. There are 16 big loops here, piled one on top of the other. All the rigging is very rugged and can stand up to severe weather. Working out on a yardarm is a bit precarious, as you're standing on a foot rope which moves around a great deal, not just from your own actions, but from the actions of other crewmates. Working on the spritsail yard beneath the bowsprit can be exciting, as you're close to the water and occasionally under it. Here are 8 crew furling the forecourse. It's heavy work, so teamwork is the name of the game. Furling the fore and aft sails can be a bit of a challenge, as it's hard to get at them. Look halfway up the foremast and you'll find 2 crew furling a staysail while standing on light lines stretched across the shrouds. This is the arrangement, and you sometimes needed 3 hands, 1 for hanging on and 2 for doing the work. So some people hang on with their stomachs. It helps if you have a good sense of balance when perched on top of a yard. Tina, the topman, is perfectly at home, sitting on the foot rope while making a repair to the spritzel. And if you're the confident type who likes to take risks, you can just walk on air, as Jason is doing here while clearing a fouled line. During our voyage, the normal trade winds were disrupted, forcing us much further south than intended. On several occasions, when the weather was calm, the captain would declare swim call. It's a memorable sensation to dangle your feet into ocean a couple of miles deep. And for some strange reason, nobody seems to stray very far from the ship. This swim call must have been an early one before people had picked up much of a tan. We always had a boat in the water and a shark watch with rifle looking down from the fighting top. The hard part is getting back on board. This is the boarding ladder, which has no handholds, and the bottom step is 18 inches above the water. They drop a man rope down on either side. You grab one in each hand. You wait until the ship rolls towards you. You throw your head back and your feet up in the air and hope you reach the first step. And then you pull. For some, it's a challenge. This is not my photo, but I wanted to show you the anchors. Cook lost one anchor on the Great Barrier Reef, which was recovered in recent years, and these large anchors are cast directly from the original. They are 12 feet tall and weigh about 2,000 pounds. Just to the left of the red bandana, you'll see a black platform with a round hole in it. There is one on each side of the bowsprit, and they were called the seats of ease, and these comprised the toilet facilities on Cook's ship. A rather uneasy and precarious seat in a howling gale. The officers and gentlemen back aft had the luxury of chamber pots. When Cook's Endeavour struck the Great Barrier Reef, he tried to lighten ship by throwing overboard 6 of his 10 cannon. These too have been recovered, and the present ship carries 4 exact working replicas cast directly from the originals. The captain loves them, and they get fired regularly with charges of black powder. One of the special moments on any long voyage is the first sighting of land. We are here closing with the jagged peaks of the Cape Verde Islands. We came alongside in the port of Mindela to take on fuel and food. Across the pier was the Royal Navy's most modern frigate, HMS Monmouth, capable of 39 knots, filled with sophisticated missiles, and manned by a tiny crew. In fact, there's no crew at all in the engine room, and in combat the captain is not on the bridge, but buried deep in the center of the ship, surrounded by a mass of electronic gear and computers. 2 state-of-the-art ships of the Royal Navy, separated by the pier and 230 years. Quite an interesting contrast, I thought. We got underway in less than a day and went back to shipboard routines. Each afternoon, the crew spends several hours doing ship's work. Here, they're breaking out new line to replace a halyard, scraping and sanding the mizzenmast prior to new varnish. It's a tough job when sails and lines under tension are always in the way. Behind them, this group is cutting and sewing canvas and making up new life raft covers. The spritzel scooped up a sea and split, so it was brought aboard so a couple of new panels could be sewn in by hand. Some fool had earlier varnished the big teak grating over the main hatch, and we spent days scraping and sanding it down to bare wood so it could then be oiled. This Scottish woman and I spent 10 days scraping, sanding, and painting this big skylight, which contained 54 panes of glass. A major job, made worse by the fact that paint scrapings and dust are blown everywhere by the wind, and there's no such thing as a vacuum cleaner. People routinely worked over the side in good weather. The shipwright here is checking the bobstay that holds the bowsprit down. And this fellow is painting an anchor with fish oil to control rust. The wooden carriage of this cannon is getting sanded and painted. Note the heavy wooden bucket and the heavy lines on the 2 black timber heads. These crew members are engaged in making sword mats. Sword mats are heavy mats woven of discarded rope and used all over the ship as chafing gear. The bosun is making up new rigging here, and at the left you'll see a typical use for a sword mat if you look at how one is being used to protect the rail where the anchor rests upon it. The crew works long and hard, and they relish any chance to collapse on the deck for a snooze. With his head gently cradled by a coil of rope, this fellow thinks he's in heaven. But it wasn't all work. On Valentine's Day, the crew held a desperate and dateless ball on the lower deck, 1 beer per person and a wide variety of costumes. To even up the boys and girls, the bosun had earlier that day accosted unsuspecting males with the greeting, "Congratulations, you're a girl." And here is the captain with one of the results, a very fetching blonde. The shipwright compensated for his beard with a lovely tiara and bracelet made of aluminum foil. On a separate occasion, the crew held a sod's opera, when each watch competed in putting on a skit. On the left, in the white t-shirt, the cook's helper plays the part of Cinderella, scrubbing the deck under the eye of the evil stepmother on the right, with red stripes and rope hair that reaches the deck. But fear not, for on the right, coming to the rescue, is the good fairy, dressed in a tutu made of crumpled paper towels. Of course, the players have the enormous advantage of a totally captive audience. Crew members have a choice: either watch the show or jump overboard. Day after day, the ship is always sailing on. This, too, is not my photo, but it's a very nice one. First mate on the left, myself in the middle, captain on the right, all dressed in our Australian oilskins called Dryzabone, spelled with a Z. I was fortunate to spend many hours at the helm, including every time we entered or left port, which was a real workout when you man the wheel alone. When you go aloft, you start on the lower shrouds, which slant inward towards the mast, but just below the fighting top you have to hang backwards as you climb the futtock shrouds, which slant away from the mast until you get over the edge. This is the view looking forward from the main fighting top, and if you look very closely, you might see 2 crew standing in the foremast fighting top below. From the same location, but looking aft, at the mizzen, and down on the helm and the binnacle. If you keep climbing to the uppermost level, you can actually look down on the top of the mizzenmast. When climbing the rigging, only your feet go on the horizontal ratlins, and your hands always grasp the large black vertical shrouds. The rigging is coated with real tar, and when it's fresh or when the weather turns hot, you get absolutely covered. There's no doubt about where the term jack tar comes from. I suggest you leave your white clothes at home. As in the original ship, the forward end of the lower deck has two tiny cabins on each side, for the carpenter, the sailmaker, the boatswain, and for a boatswain's locker. And hidden in the dark background is a huge iron stove, which was the galley on the original Endeavour. The Admiralty assigned Endeavour a cook who had only one leg, and when the captain objected and asked if they couldn't please send somebody else, the Admiralty kindly obliged by sending a cook with only one arm, and that man cooked for 95 men for 3 years on a wood-burning stove. In the tropics, the heat must have been unbearable. But this was the Social Security program for disabled sailors at that time. At night, the lower deck is filled with hammocks for the crew. It promotes togetherness. In the Royal Navy, hammocks were only 16 inches apart, centerline to centerline, and when the ship rolled, they were all banging against each other. When I showed the cutaway ship model, I mentioned that the lower deck on which I'm standing was added by the Admiralty, creating good headroom amidships but terrible headroom aft. The deck above me supports the original living space, which became the gentlemen's quarters. I am crouching in the area called the Marines, because Navy regulations required that a contingent of Marines be physically located between the crew and the officers to guard against mutiny. 12 Marines lived in this space for 3 years, and when I saw it, I said, I sure hope they knew how to fight lying down. Some of our crew lived in this space in hammocks, hanging only a few inches above the deck. In the early Navy, women were occasionally allowed on board when the ship was in port. At reveille, the cry was, "Wakey, wakey, rise and shine, show a leg." And if the proffered leg looked reasonably female, that person could stay in the hammock a while longer. Aft of the Marines, the ship's officers lived in cabins which were more like rabbit hutches, with headroom of about 4 feet. The present Endeavour has a modern galley and eating area located in the lower hold, which in the original ship would have been filled with barrels of supplies. Our food was good, but in the 1700s they still didn't know the cause of scurvy, which killed very large numbers of seamen. Captain Cook was the first to complete a long voyage without losing a single man to scurvy. Of the 95 men on board, 38 died of other causes, but none from scurvy. He fed the crew sauerkraut, malt, and fresh meat and vegetables whenever possible, and treated early symptoms with a marmalade of oranges and lemons. But in the final analysis, he wasn't able to pinpoint precisely which food had prevented the scurvy, so the problem persisted for another 50 years. In 1768, the eating arrangements for the crew looked like this. 6 men were assigned to each mess, where they sat on sea chests and ate off a table which folded up when not in use. The 6 tassels on the ropes provided the men with a napkin on which to wipe their greasy hands. Back aft, above the officers' cabins, is the high-rent district, where Captain Cook and Joseph Banks and his staff lived. This is the wardroom, off which opened several cabins. The vertical white column here is not a mast, but the shaft for the capstan which is up on the weather deck. I had the cabin originally occupied by Charles Green, the astronomer supplied by the Royal Society to observe the transit of Venus. It was furnished with a chair, a small desk, and instead of a hammock, a swinging cot, similar to what Admiral Lord Nelson used. Many people went barefoot, and you could track the wet footprints all over the ship. When the ship is in port and open to the public, the cabins are fitted out as a museum, with period clothing, books, and artifacts. Many items, like this chair, are genuine period antiques, and in this cabin one of Banks' artists is imagined working on a botanical drawing. Disguised behind one of the cabin doors is a modern navigation station, where you find our barefoot captain working out our position. The most elegant space is the great cabin at the stern, seen here as it would have looked in Cook's time, with Joseph Banks and his team using the big cabin table for scientific studies. Following the mutiny on the Bounty, the Admiralty sent a ship named Pandora to capture the mutineers, and that ship was wrecked on the Great Barrier Reef. The brass-bound fireplace seen at the far right of this photo is a precise duplicate of the fireplace recovered from the wreck of the Pandora. It's worth noting that Captain Cook's most brilliant navigation protege was William Bligh, who sailed with Cook on the third voyage, and who was also a close lifetime friend of Sir Joseph Banks. The cabin has full headroom, 4 windows in the stern, and 1 on each side. The deck slants sharply uphill, and there are 2 window seats at the very stern, perfect for reading. When reading there, you can glance down through the stern window and watch the lovely blue and white mosaic of the wake. Sunset astern, with the copper lantern on the right, fitted to take 4 candles. A few sailors might recognize the ancient phrase, "haul on your bowlines," which refers to the line at the bottom of this photo. It's attached to the leech of a square sail, and when you're hard on the wind, you use it to pull the edge of the sail forward. Square riggers are certainly photogenic. The visual aesthetics of the silhouettes and curves are a constant delight to the eye. Upper and lower stunsails have been set here. These are additional light sails, spelled studding sails, but pronounced stunsails, somewhat analogous to setting a spinnaker on a modern yacht. The lower stunsail is set from a spar, which slides out from the top of the yardarm, and the upper stunsail is on its own spar, seen being hoisted into place. The result is impressive and can add up to 4,000 additional square feet of sail, which can add a knot to the ship's speed. Performing these jobs, the crew become pretty good acrobats, but I wouldn't advise you to try this at home. The captain adored his stunsails, and 4 are set here. The ship is inherently slow. Top speed was 10 knots, the best speed over 24 hours was 6.7 knots, and in planning for long passages, a speed of 4 knots is assumed. Approaching the Caribbean, we launched the inflatable boat, and I was able to cruise around the ship taking photos. The spritzels under the bowsprit hark back to the days of Christopher Columbus, and many people assume that they are inefficient or useless. But surprisingly, they have proven to be effective and useful sails. Besides being a great learning experience for today's sailors, Endeavour serves as a living monument to the tremendous accomplishments of Captain James Cook, who, through self-education, became an extraordinary combination of seaman, leader, navigator, explorer, and cartographer before he was murdered by natives on Hawaii during his third voyage. In the final analysis, the Endeavour replica is about history and the romance of early seafaring. It's a curious fact that the remains of Cook's ship are believed to lie in relatively shallow water in Newport, Rhode Island, where she was scuttled by the British retreating during the Revolutionary War. The permanent crew who spend years aboard Endeavour are literally transformed into creatures of an earlier world, and it's probably difficult for some of them to make the transition back into the complex modern world. As my voyage drew to a close, I concluded that I was very fortunate to have a wife whose idea of a good Christmas present was to send me off to sea. Finally, when the sails were furled for the last time in West Palm Beach, we have what might be called the Crew Bottom Review, which gives me the excuse to say that we have reached the very end. I'm glad you were able to join me, and I hope you enjoyed your cruise.